My very first grappling tournament of all time is coming up, and I'm pretty stoked. And the reason I'm doing it is so that I can use it to leverage myself in MMA. And I would assume that a lot of you guys grapple not only because you want to grapple, but because you are either interested in picking up striking and becoming a more well-rounded fighter. So in today's episode of the arshansamimian show, I'm going to be giving you the exact 5-step blueprint on how you can use grappling to leverage yourself in mixed martial arts. Without further ado, let's begin. First thing we're going to talk about is prioritizing control. So what we found in the UFC is that control time is the #1 predictor of a win. In the UFC, the fighter with the more control time wins roughly 80% of the time if it goes to the judges. And the point here is that you don't want to hunt the neck and lose the position. Points in tournaments build the habit of dominating a map, which translates directly to winning rounds in the MMA. So what is my point here? My point here is that you want to prioritize control. So let me give you a quick story. When I first started out grappling, which is literally in January of this year, not that long, I didn't really know what I was doing. Most of the time, my goal was just to look tough and get control of the other person with brute strength. Little did I know, that's not really how it works in grappling, and a lot of it is purely technical, not only about strength. So my goal eventually just became to survive. The problem with trying either to survive or trying to simply use your strength is that it's not really going to help you that much because you don't really know what you're doing. But the thing about if you want to compete in MMA or if you want to actually dominate in MMA is that taking the ground control all the time and being in that position where the other person has control can actually put you in a hindrance of a position. We have seen this with, I believe I watched a fight with Nick Diaz where he was fighting a guy who was constantly getting top position who eventually won against him. And even though his submission defense was really well, he did not manage to win the fight, unfortunately. So the point goes to show that no matter how good your grappling is and how good at defensive maneuvers you are, takedown defense, whatever it may be, you have to learn to eventually transition to some sort of control. And what you can do is you can learn from the best of the best. You can learn from Khamzat, Khabib, Islam, Merab. All these guys have great skills, and you can learn to have some sort of a focus when you are training to focus on control. What I would prioritize is using back control, learning to develop the ability to do single or double leg takedown, learning to quickly sprawl and go to the mount on your opponent, and not only to get into that position, but to actually stay there as long as you possibly can. When you actually go from being the person who simply lays on the ground and tries to defend everything to being the person who takes the initiative and isn't too hesitant, you eventually develop that mechanics, the ability to literally do this kind of thing fundamentally in your sleep, so that when the time comes to actually implement it in a real MMA match, you're not simply standing there hesitant, waiting for the other person to take you down first so that you can simply defend, which puts you at a disadvantage because it gives the other guy the necessary points, but it actually helps you to defend in a match. Another way this carries over is in a self-defense scenario street fight. Although vast majority of time, I can admit people do have weapons, so it is not advisable. If it is a last resort and you find yourself in a situation where you do have to get in a street fight or a self-defense scenario, the last thing you want to do is end up on the ground. The best thing you could do for yourself if you have to use grappling is to use takedowns. And that's why practicing grappling is arguably one of the best things. But not only that, focusing on the wrestling aspect of it, which will help you that much more. #2, strength training. I already told you guys that strength training is not always the most beneficial thing, but that doesn't go to show that strength training isn't useful at all. When I was 11 years old, I was very, very skinny, frail, and I was the weak kid, and I was pretty insecure about it, which is why I started doing push-ups, as many as possible. And I didn't really know what I was doing, but I knew that I had a goal, which is to get bigger and stronger. Eventually, over time, I transitioned into weightlifting when I was around 14. I'm 19 now. So over time, all the work that I've done has carried over to where I am now. I'm by no means an IFBB Pro bodybuilder, a power lifter. I don't have that kind of strength or crazy stability, but what I can say is that I have developed a foundation that has carried over really, really well, not only into all aspects of my life, but most particularly to grappling, where things like strength, stability, grip strength, the ability to have long bouts of stamina and wear your opponent down by laying on top of him or not allowing the other person to easily submit you, all of these key things are crucial. But the real question about strength training is not exactly, do you do it or not, which is an obvious answer that you should. It's how do you program and structure it into your routine. I'm going to be giving you the quick steps on how. 3 to 4 times is what I like to ideally aim for strength training, but it doesn't really matter if it's 3, 4, 2 times or 5 times, but I would ideally aim for 2 to 4 based on your own preferences. 1 is probably a little too low, but what I like to focus on is the 10 compound lifts, all with barbells, and the only 2 that are weighted calisthenics, not using barbells: bench, squat, deadlift, rows, overhead press, RDLs, front squats, Bulgarian split squats, weighted pull-ups, weighted dips. To back this up, we have seen that science shows that isometric strength, holding people in eccentric control, which is linked with lifting people, for example, single leg takedowns, double leg takedowns, doing a farmer's carry, whatever it is, are the top physical markers for elite grapplers. So the point here is that striking is speed, which is great for explosivity, but a large part of MMA and fights in general come down to grappling, which is stability based. And generating these types of heavy compound lifts, squats, deadlifts most particularly, will help you build that anchor you need to keep a resisting opponent from moving you, which is arguably one of the most critical elements of grappling. Number 3, grappling with wrestlers and watching footage of these wrestlers. We've all heard the phrase, go to Dagestan 2-3 years and forget, and probably it's true because grappling is a very, and wrestling most particularly, is a very critical element in MMA. The thing about it is that it's not something you can just ignore and try to maneuver around 100% as if it doesn't exist. We have seen the best of the best fighters. We've seen Khamzat Chimaev, we have seen Khabib Nurmagomedov, we have seen them dominate in fights. We've seen when Chael Sonnen dominated Anderson Silva for the entire fight until the end where he lost. But if it weren't for that last round where he lost, he probably would have won because the whole time he had top control in that wrestling position, the Greco wrestling. We've seen all these other fighters who train in Dagestan, all other places around the world, being the people who actually dominate these fights. When the UFC started and when MMA became a much more transition thing, when grappling, wrestling became much more critical, you saw these types of fighters dominating in a fight. Bruce Lee himself admitted that a person who simply trained in a traditional art like Kung Fu, who goes up into a much more well-rounded athletic fighter who knows things like wrestling, is bound to get dominated. So how do you actually implement this in your life? Well, we know based on data that Khabib averaged over 5 takedowns per fight. Merab set a record of 49 attempts in one match, so you see that wrestling is critical. But the point is that it's not about one shot. It's about chain wrestling. So you have to learn to study from other fighters, learning and absorbing as much knowledge as you can from them. For example, watching the fighters that I just mentioned, Khabib in his fight against Conor McGregor, for example, Khamzat Chimaev and the numerous people that he's fought, Merab versus Sugarshan O'Malley, Islam Makhachev versus practically anyone out there. These guys have a plethora of skills. And if you learn not only to watch them, but to practice implementing their moves over and over and over to the point that it becomes a functional part of your muscle memory when you train, you will become an efficient fighter. This goes to show that just because there might not be a million wrestling gyms around you, and if grappling is the only option you have, it doesn't mean you can't become a functional and great wrestler. If you learn to develop these basic skills of explosivity and takedowns, you can become one of the most dangerous fighters who can fight off pretty much most wrestlers, unless they're an exception. Number 4, one wrestling focus. The thing about fighting and life is that to a degree it is linked with the concept of progressive overload, which we all know from lifting. In lifting, when you were hitting a barbell, when you were doing a bicep curl, the goal is not simply to do that as many times as you can, it is to progressively overload, to add more reps, to add more weight, and to compound that over time to add more volume. The same way that you approach this, you can approach it through your training sessions. Say when you are striking, you do a 1, 2, 3. You want to aim and hit with that combination as many possible times as you can efficiently. The same exact thing goes for grappling. For example, for me, I have always sucked at takedowns. I've always been good at just basic headlocks, surviving submissions, but a point in time comes where you have to learn to be the dominator in these types of fights, to be the aggressor. What I would focus on and what I would recommend for you guys is deliberate practice, which has proven to be 3 times faster for learning than trying to learn 10 moves at once. What do I mean by this? Aim for simply 1 successful move per session. Say that you are a newbie and you don't really know what you're doing, which is still kind of the stage that I'm at with grappling in particular. Focus on a single leg takedown and see, okay, I want to aim for this one session to hit it just once. If I can hit 1 single leg takedown, I will be proud of myself. And even if I fail, at least I tried. The point is that you're trying. And then say one day you do manage to successfully hit that one takedown once. Next time, okay, now that I hit it once, I want to see if I can actually do a takedown with a single leg 2 times. By the time you've done it so many times, you will have been able to do it 10 times in a round without even thinking. And by the time you get to that point, you can eventually transition to other things, like a double leg takedown, a back control, a quick mount, an arm bar, whatever it is that you wish to implement in your training that you're lacking in. Over time, these things will compound and you will find that you'll become a much more well-rounded fighter, not only in one aspect of grappling, but in all aspects that will carry over to wrestling and pretty much all of fighting as a whole when you transition to MMA. Last but not least is something that not everybody is in favor of, but it is purposefully putting yourself in detrimental positions. What we have found from data is that fighters who spend 2+ minutes on their back lose the round 95% of the time. What is the point of it? Putting yourself in that kind of position. You don't want to get into that position when you are in an actual fight, but if you are in an actual fight and you are in the ring or in the cage and you find yourself in that position and there is that much of a risk of you losing the fight and being placed in that position, that means that you are put at a disadvantage, but that doesn't mean you've fully lost the fight. How do you guarantee that you can still win a fight from this position? Easy. Put yourself in that situation. There is a reason why fighters practice defending in the corner, practicing defense, because chances are they're going to get hit sometimes. Chances are their opponent is going to be more of an aggressor and might dominate some of the fight. So you have to learn, how am I going to defend this? What will I do in this kind of scenario? The biggest part about fighting, combat as a whole, and all sports in general is the what-if scenario, which is the reason behind drilling, because there are so many places and positions you can find yourself in. If you learn to leverage yourself in grappling, not only by learning to be the aggressor, but by learning to be the defender who can actually act and lay on the ground and defend everything as much as possible, and learn how to actually get yourself back up, you become that much more efficient. And finally, when we link everything as a whole, we look at number 1, prioritizing control. Number 2, strength training 3 to 4 times a week, the 10 main compound lifts. Number 3, grappling with as many wrestlers as possible and watching fight footage. Number 4, focusing on 1 wrestling move per training session and perfecting it to completion before you move on to other moves. And finally, last but not least, number 5, purposefully putting yourself in detrimental positions. I guarantee you will become a great fighter in grappling and many aspects of wrestling, which will help carry over to any aspect and realm of your fighting, whether it is learning to transition from punches to takedowns, whether it is learning to defend against takedowns, and finally, whether you're going up against a complete D1 wrestler who wants to tear your head off. These will all carry over well, regardless if your goal in life is to simply be athletic and defend yourself for self-defense scenarios. If it is a last resort, of course, this will carry over really well. Thank you all very much for watching this episode of the arshansamimian show. If you enjoyed, please subscribe, share this with your buddies, follow, and as always, stay blessed.